Hello guys, tonight's story isn't about empires or epics. It's about something slower, heavier, the kind of a history you don't read in books. You feel it in the cold, in the silence between trees, in the creak of a longhouse wall holding back another winter. So before you drift off, give this video a like if it earns it, and subscribe if stories like this speak to you. Now turn down the lights, maybe light a candle, because tonight we're sailing upriver, through ice floes and reed-choked banks, past smoke, mud and memory, and at the end of it all, a place without a name, where Norse and Slavic tongues mix like snow in firewood, where gods are forgotten and reborn in the same breath, and where the people didn't conquer, they stayed. Congratulations. You've just stepped into the first Viking colony in Russia. Imagine yourself standing on the edge of a slow, wide river. It's early spring, but the cold hasn't left. The air still bites. The ice is melting in thick, cracked slab, drifting past the long hull of your boat. A boat that creaks with every thawing gust of wind. You've come far, weeks by water. The sea behind you is salted and angry, but this river is strange, brown, still choked with reeds. It smells of rot and mud and something else, something old. This is not Scandinavia. This is the edge of something foreign, something vast. You don't know the word for it yet, but centuries from now, people will call it Russia. The Vikings who came here didn't call themselves that. They were Varangians, wanderers, traders, mercenaries. They followed water like others followed stars. And here, deep in the Slavic forests, they found more than just land. They found something they didn't expect: people. Not just scattered villages, but entire networks of tribes, with their own gods, their own rites, and their own names for the river. Names the Norse couldn't pronounce, and yet they stayed. Not for conquest, not yet, but for trade, for timber, for furs, for survival, because even warriors have to eat. Even raiders need roofs in winter. And here, at the mouth of the Volkhov River, where the water narrowed and the banks offered just enough dry ground, they built wooden longhouses, damp and narrow, palisades of logs sharpened to points, smoke curling out from crooked chimneys, the smell of pine and ash and sour meat. The first Norse colony on Slavic land. Now imagine yourself inside one of those longhouses. It's not large. It smells of damp wood, smoke, wool, and something sour. Maybe turnip left too long near the fire. The floor is packed earth. Cold seeps up through your boots. Every log wall is sealed with moss to keep the wind out, but it never really works. There are people sleeping on benches along the walls. A family, a crew, maybe both. No one talks much in winter. You pull your cloak tighter, it still doesn't help. Outside, the forest presses in. Snow sits heavy on the pine boughs. There's no sound, only the occasional snap of ice shifting, like a tree breathing in its sleep. Inside, there's the quiet rhythm of survival. Stir the pot, feed the fire, sharpen a tool, chew on dried fish. Don't ask where it came from. Sleep if you can, dream if you must. You've eaten the last of the fresh meat. There's still some smoked pork, but it tastes faintly of the chimney it hung in. And you've started saving it, piece by piece. The rest is mush, boiled grain, onion, anything that keeps the hunger quiet. Some nights, the stew includes something a little unfamiliar. Roots with a bitter tang. A dried mushroom that makes you feel distant when you close your eyes. You don't ask, because food in winter is not about flavor. It's about continuing. Every morning you wake up colder than the night before. You don't speak the Slavic tongue yet, but one of your neighbors does. He's a tall man with quiet hands and deep eyes. He traded furs for a hatchet, and now he's here helping patch the roof. You don't trust him, but you nod, and he nods back. That's enough, for now. Not every winter ends cleanly. Sometimes the sickness comes. It moves through the longhouse like fog. A cough, a fever, a silence that doesn't lift. You burn herbs in the fire pit and hang bone charms over the door. Old habits from your grandmother's village. Whether they work or not, it helps to have something to do. And then slowly, the ice begins to crack. Water starts moving again. Not loudly, just the soft sigh of a river waking up. And you step outside, blinking into the pale sun, wondering if you survived, or if something else now wears your body. But the others stir too. The smoke begins again. Tools are lifted. Spring has come, or something like it, and life once again begins its slow crawl forward. By the time the river flows freely again, the world feels new, but not safe. The mud returns first, thick, clinging. It gets everywhere, in your boots, under your fingernails, even in your breath. Then come the insects. Tiny, buzzing reminders that life is returning whether you're ready or not. The colony stirs. The gates are opened wider. And from upriver and down, boats arrive. Not warships, but dugouts. Flat-bottomed craft carved from single trees, carried downriver by men who speak in tones thick with Slavic consonants. And smiles that don't reach their eyes. They bring furs. Mostly sable, mink, fox. Soft, dark, valuable. In return, you offer iron tools, beads, and a few broken pieces of silver. It's not always equal, but nothing ever is. Some trade with warmth. A shared cup of fermented rye. Laughter at poorly spoken words. An arm around the shoulder. Others are colder, businesslike. Eyes watching your weapons more than your face. Still, you trade. Because you must. Because winter will come again. Because your people are too few to grow everything themselves. Because sometimes survival has less to do with strength. And more with speaking carefully. But the language barrier is more than just inconvenient. It's dangerous. A word misheard can become an insult. A gesture misread can become a threat. And when your sword is at your hip while you're trying to offer bread. Things can turn quickly, so you learn. One word at a time. You point. You mimic. You listen. Eventually, you know enough to ask for salt, or warn of wolves, or say, "I don't want trouble." A phrase that becomes more useful than all the others. Children learn faster. Half Slavic, half Norse. They run between longhouses with muddy feet and 2 languages in their mouths. They call each other names no adult understands. They mock your accent. They laugh in 2 dialects at once. You realize quietly that the future speaks differently than you do. And that's how colonies grow. Not with walls, but with words. Still, not everyone likes this. Some of your crew believe the Slavs are using you. Others fear they're watching too closely. They whisper about betrayal, about arrows in the back, or poisoned stew. You listen, you understand, but you don't agree. Because you've eaten that stew, and it tasted the same as yours, just colder. Not every death comes with banners, or song, or even a grave. Some just happen. A slip on the ice, a fever in the night, a wound that looked small until it didn't stop bleeding. Out here, so far from home, where the trees don't speak your language and the gods feel very far away, death arrives without ceremony, and yet it's always noticed. When one of your own dies, a man you rode beside for weeks, who drank too loudly and snored worse, you don't weep. You sit quietly. You let the fire burn low, and you wrap his body in what cloth you can spare. There's no priest here, no funeral pyre in the old style, no proper rites. So you improvise. You tie his hair with thread. You place his blade beside him, though rust has already eaten half the edge. And you bury him near the river, where the ground is soft enough to dig. And the trees grow just far enough apart to let in the light. It is not heroic. It is not worthy of saga. But it is enough. A small human gesture against the vastness of time. The Slavs bury their dead differently. Some under mounds, some near water, some with strange tokens and carved wooden faces meant to guard the soul. You notice this. You do not ask questions, but you watch and wonder if their gods listen better than yours. As months pass, the dead become part of the landscape, not in a haunting way, but in the way old roots hold the soil together. You remember where they were buried. You walk past softly. You speak their names when you can. And sometimes you feel as though the forest is listening back. But not every death is quiet. One day, a trader is found with an arrow in his side. Not one of yours, not a known face. He died in the reeds, face down, near a place where two tribes had once fought, long before you arrived. No one claims the body. No one mourns him. But the air shifts, a little tenser, a little sharper, and you realize something that will echo in the years to come. You are not alone here. Not really. Even if it feels like you are. You carry that awareness now. Every time you sharpen a blade, every time the wind carries unfamiliar voices across the trees, you are not at war, but you are not at peace. You exist in between. That too is a kind of death. The snow retreats. Not quickly. It never does. It leaves in patches, with soggy footprints, and small, cold ghosts that linger in shaded places long after the sky turns bright. But eventually, it goes. And with it comes change. Spring doesn't mean flowers here. Not yet. It means mud. It means motion. It means sound. The river, once silent and frozen, now speaks again. Low, gurgling phrases as it chews away the ice, and carries winter's secrets down to the sea. The forest wakes. Birdsong returns, not cheerful, but curious. The crackle of thawed branches, the scamper of things long asleep, and the far-off howl of something you've never seen, but have always known was there. And with the forest comes movement. Not just animals, people, boats, not warships, though every hull brings with it the possibility of war, but dugouts again, heavy with goods, light on ceremony. You rise earlier, you check the gates, you count your knives, and you begin, once again, the old rhythm of trade. But spring movement is not only about goods, it is about people leaving. Some of your group pack their things. They say the winter was too hard. They say they miss the sea. Others don't say anything at all. They just go. And for every person that leaves, someone else arrives. A cousin. A stranger with red clay on his boots. A Slavic woman with a baby and no man beside her. The colony does not grow evenly. It stretches, contracts, holds its breath. You are not building a city. Not yet. You are building a possibility, and spring is the test. The Slavs begin to plant. Not crops, but things with names you cannot pronounce. Round roots. Greens that smell like onion and wet stone. Grain that grows low and golden. You watch. You help, awkwardly. They laugh at the way you hold the tools, but they do not stop you. And when the planting is done, you are invited to drink. It's thick, fermented, sour, but it burns clean, and you drink it with both hands. That night, you sleep next to people who don't share your tongue, but do share your fire, and something in your ribs feels lighter. You are not friends, not yet, but the fear is smaller now, and in the hush between night sounds, you realize something simple. No one survives alone. Not here, not where the river bends and the trees don't end. By late spring, the settlement looks real. It's no longer just a camp or a cluster of cautious longhouses beside the river. There are fences now, gardens, if you're generous, a place where fish are cleaned, and another where hides are smoked, a trail beaten hard by bare feet and dragging sleds, one that didn't exist when you arrived, but feels like it's always been there. This isn't a home yet, but it's not a journey anymore either. It's something in between, something becoming. You start to notice patterns. The Slavic elders tie colored cords to certain trees. They whisper before crossing the river bend. They avoid a patch of moss near the northern edge of the forest. No one says why. Your people build a small wooden figure and leave it near the palisade. It's not a god, not exactly, but it watches the edge of the trees, and that seems like enough. Someone carves symbols into the doorway of the main house. They're not Norse runes. They're not Slavic glyphs. They're something new. No one admits to making them, but no one removes them either. These small things, scraps of wood, bone, habits, become anchors. Rituals not born from belief, but from repetition. You don't know whose customs they are anymore. And maybe that's the point. You are all living in the yards between worlds. Sometimes a merchant arrives from farther south, from Kiev maybe, or even the Byzantine lands. They wear colors too bright for this place. They smell of spices and strange oils. They speak a third language and speak it fast. You watch your people try to barter. The coins they offer are too worn. The furs too common. The southern man smiles with only half his mouth. Eventually, a deal is made. A bolt of silk changes hands. A necklace carved from bone. A rusted axe. A whispered word you don't understand. And then the merchant is gone. Like a bird passing through. You think about him for days afterward. The way he looked at your camp, as if it was already history. One evening, you sit on a log, sharpening a blade that no longer holds its edge. The fire crackles, the sky softens into lavender, and the boy beside you, the one with the Slavic mother and Norse eyes, asks you a question. Are we still Vikings? You don't answer right away, because you're not sure. You've not raided in over a year. Your sword is now more rust than iron. You speak in 3 tongues, none fluently. And your dreams, they no longer take place at sea. You're not a native, but you're not a stranger either. You're something else, something that doesn't have a word yet. You stare at the river. It reflects the sky in broken fragments. And slowly, quietly, you say, maybe. Imagine yourself as one of the Slavs, a generation or 2 after the first longships came up the river. The settlement is larger now. There are children who've never seen the sea, but who speak words their parents once feared. The winters are just as long, but the houses are better built. Trade is better too. You still watch the horizon, but not for raiders, for merchants, for allies, for people like him. His name is Rurik, and like all important names from the past, his arrival is wrapped in fog. Some say he came from across the sea, summoned by Slavic tribes tired of their own infighting, invited to rule because no one local could be trusted. Others say he took power the usual way, with blades and bravado, and a boat full of men who didn't ask before taking. But most stories agree on this. He didn't come with fire. He came with structure, and something in his bearing. The way he stood still while others shouted, the way his voice didn't rise but still carried, made people listen. Rurik wasn't a king, not yet, but he acted like one. He organized patrols, settled disputes, demanded tribute, but also offered protection. In a land of shifting alliances and brittle trust, he gave people something surprising: continuity. The settlement he ruled, Ladoga, or perhaps Novgorod depending on the year, became more than just a cluster of houses. It became a hub, a name people spoke in distant villages, a place with rules and markets and expectations. And Rurik, he didn't shout from walls or ride with flaming banners. He stayed, which in a world shaped by departure meant more than conquest. He likely spoke a mix of Norse and broken Slavic. He may have kept a court of warriors and interpreters. He may have worn furs or silk stolen from a raid years ago, or both. No one can say for sure. But the people followed him, willingly it seems, not because he was born here, but because he acted as if he would die here. And in time, he did. But the story didn't end, because Rurik was just a man. But Rus, that would become a name for an entire people. Rurik ruled from a settlement that didn't yet know what it would become. It was not the center of an empire. It was not even fully a city, just a bend in the river, a handful of buildings, and a reputation that began to echo beyond its own borders. But in a land where time flows slowly, where the seasons carve more than the sword, this was enough. Because Rurik did something rare, he stayed long enough to lay roots. Not deep ones, not yet, but firm. He established a kind of order, the beginnings of law, of tribute, of defense, and he passed this structure to his son, or rather, to someone the chronicles called his son, though even that is shrouded in the mist of history. Igor, they say, small, serious, raised among Slavs and Norse alike. He did not remember the voyage across the sea. He did not know the taste of sea air or the thunder of raids. He was born inland, among rivers, among birch forests and smoky halls. He did not inherit a kingdom. He inherited the possibility of one. Rurik's death, when it came, was not a tale of heroism. No saga, no final battle. Just the quiet ending of a life lived far from home. His burial, if it happened here, is lost. No great mound, no stone marker, just stories, and a settlement that kept his name. His legacy didn't march forward like a conqueror. It seeped into the ground, into the names of rivers, into the trade routes that began to bend toward his memory, and into the language. Rus, not just a place, but a people. A word that would stretch, change, and eventually become a country. But none of that was certain then. Back then, Igor was just a boy. A colony was just a cluster of hopes. And every spring, the rivers still flooded, and the snow still returned, as if to test how real any of this truly was. And yet, they endured, not by force, but by structure, by adaptation, by diplomacy when it worked, by violence when it didn't. The dynasty had begun, not with glory but with stubbornness, not with splendor but with survival. Not every rule is welcomed, and not every alliance stays whole. Even in those earliest years, when the colony was still young, when Rurik's memory was fresh, and when his son Igor was still learning how to wear the weight of power, there were tensions beneath the frost. Because peace, especially in a place with so many tongues and loyalties, is never quiet for long. The Slavic tribes had not vanished. They had not surrendered. They had made room. Some did so out of caution, others out of necessity, and a few out of true partnership. But many did not forget that the Norsemen came from elsewhere, that they built walls and watchtowers, that they demanded tribute even if they called it protection. And while Rurik may have ruled with care, those who followed him, those who claimed his legacy, would not all do the same. There were cracks between the houses, literal ones, in the buildings hurriedly built in spring and crumbling by winter, and political ones, quiet whispers between leaders who had smiled too often with clenched teeth. Some Slavic clans had wanted Rurik to be a temporary solution, a mediator, an outsider who could settle disputes, and then return to the sea. But he stayed, and when he died, his kin stayed too, and began to act not as guests, but as rulers. Tribute became expected, then demanded, then enforced. Where once there was barter, now there were tax collectors. Where once there were shared fires, now there were guarded gates. Not everywhere, not all at once, but enough. Enough for anger to grow like moss beneath a stone. Slow, quiet, but always spreading. And the Norse rulers too felt the tension. They no longer controlled their own fate by steel alone. They needed Slavic support, Slavic grain, Slavic knowledge of the rivers and trails. But reliance does not always breed trust. It breeds calculation, and sometimes fear. You begin to see the outlines of a question that would haunt the Rus for centuries. Were they one people now, or simply two peoples trapped in the same frostbitten story? The answer was never clear, because the names began to blend, the languages blurred. A child born in Novgorod might carry a Norse name and speak a Slavic tongue. Mothers from the forest lands married warriors from the coast. And slowly, as if sand was being poured into oil, a new identity formed. Not Norse, not Slavic, but something that had no clear center. Something that would eventually be called Rus. But even as that word took shape, the blade inside the alliance remained, sometimes hidden, sometimes drawn, because no amount of marriage or shared winter could fully erase the memory. That this began not as unity, but as necessity. Igor would not rule long, or rather dash. He ruled just long enough for others to remember his end more than his reign. He had inherited a fragile balance, one built on trade routes, shifting loyalties, and the careful diplomacy his father had once held together with weathered hands. But Igor pushed too far. The story goes that he demanded too much tribute from a Slavic tribe. The Drevlians, once allies, now something colder. They paid, then paid again, then refused. And when Igor came to collect, they did not offer coin. They offered death. It was not a battle, not a war. It was an ambush, a warning. They tied him to 2 birch trees, and let the forest do the rest. It is a brutal image, but we won't linger there, because what matters most is what came after. You might expect chaos, civil war, collapse. Instead, there was Olga, his wife, his widow, a woman the chronicles describe as composed, quiet, sharp-eyed, and patient. At first, they underestimated her, the Drevlians especially. They offered her a marriage alliance, a gesture of power disguised as diplomacy. She agreed, graciously, warmly. She welcomed their emissaries into her hall, let them bathe, rest, and then she had them buried alive. We won't focus on the revenge itself, the burning, the traps, the ash that followed, because beneath the tales of vengeance, some true, some myth, what Olga represents is not just fury, it's control. It's a moment in time when the fledgling Rus state could have unraveled and instead tightened. She ruled as regent for her son, who was too young to hold the reins, but in truth, she ruled fully. She codified tribute, reformed administration, stabilized cities. She visited Constantinople, not as a barbarian queen, but as a diplomat, a convert, a woman both feared and respected. And when she died, the Byzantine chroniclers called her a saint, the first Rus ruler to be canonized, not for miracles, but for building something that lasted. The Rus may have begun with Rurik, but they solidified under Olga, and she did it not with a sword, but with silence, with memory, and with an unshakable calm that no winter could erode. By the time Olga's son, Sviatoslav, came of age, the Rus were no longer a scattered group of river camps. They were a presence, not yet an empire, not yet a kingdom in the Western sense, but something more than survival, more than tribute, more than myth. They had buildings of stone, guards who enforced the will of rulers, messengers who carried laws between settlements, coin, trade agreements, and foreign recognition. They had, perhaps most importantly, a name, Ruski, a word that no longer simply meant those who came from the sea. Now it meant the people who stayed. But even as it solidified, the memory of Rurik stretched like a shadow across every ruler that followed. He was spoken of not as a man, but as a kind of origin myth. He became the explanation for everything that worked, and none of what failed. A distant ancestor made noble by time, wrapped in stories that blended memory and invention. His banner, we are told, bore the falcon, or the axe, or perhaps the wolf. It depends on the storyteller, and his bloodline, real or claimed, would become the backbone of dynasties. From Novgorod to Kiev, his descendants, or those who said they would have held sway for centuries. But what does it mean to trace a nation's beginning to a foreigner? To a man who may not have spoken the language, who likely worshipped different gods, and who came not to be part of a people, but to govern them. This too is part of the Rus legacy. Not just unity, but duality. Not just Slavic, not just Norse. A weaving of influences, hardship, and adaptation. By the end of the 10th century, Kiev would rise. Princes would grow more ambitious. Wars would become grander, and records more precise. But in the hush beneath it all, beneath the scrolls, the oaths, and the broken treaties, you can still hear the murmur of that first crossing, the quiet arrival, the offer of structure, the taking of power, and the story that followed. It was never just about Rurik, but without him, without his staying, his naming, his line. The Rus might have remained a directionless thread in the wind. Instead, they became something enduring. A house built on cold ground, held together by borrowed timber, marriage, memory, and time. If you stood quietly in the market at Ladoga in the mid-9th century, you wouldn't hear just one language. You'd hear many. Norse traders bargaining in clipped, sharp syllables, Slavic words flowing like the rivers they came from, the nasal twang of Baltic dialects. And further still, Greek, Arabic, even the low rolling hum of Turkic tongues. Because this wasn't just a Viking outpost anymore. It was a crossroads. The Rus weren't just raiders now. They were intermediaries, middlemen of the northern trade, sailing the cold arteries of Eastern Europe to carry goods between worlds. From the icy coasts of the Baltic, they brought furs, beeswax, honey, ironwork, and slaves. From the south, Byzantine coins, silk, spices, and glass beads arrived like rumors on the wind. Ladoga, Novgorod, and Kiev were not yet cities in the modern sense, but they buzzed with purpose, and in the middle of it all stood men who bore names from two cultures, dressed in mixed clothing, eating from wooden bowls. As they counted coins stamped with a foreign emperor's face, Rurik likely knew this world well. It's possible he had sailed all the way to Constantinople in his youth, maybe even Baghdad via the Caspian. And if he didn't, his men had. He understood that power didn't always come from conquest. It came from controlling the routes, from making sure the tolls were paid, the guards were loyal, and the merchants felt safe enough to return. Under his rule, a kind of order settled over the chaos. Tribute was demanded, yes, but the roads were safer than before. Boats arrived more regularly, and markets thrived. It's easy to imagine Rurik as a warlord, but it may be more accurate to think of him as an early governor, a broker, a fixer of things, someone who understood that in a land without walls, stability was the true treasure, and that if people could buy, sell, and survive, they would tolerate almost anything, even foreign rulers, even change, even the slow birth of something called the Rus. No one really knows where Rurik was born. The sagas don't agree. The chronicles only begin after he arrives. And the land he came from, somewhere across the Baltic, has changed so many times that it's easier to speak in shadows than in borders. Some say he was Danish, others Swedish. Others place him in the folds of a dynasty that no longer exists. But perhaps that's fitting, because Rurik wasn't meant to be remembered as a man. He was remembered as a beginning. In the Russian primary chronicle, written 2 centuries after his death, he is described as being invited to rule, as if the Slavs themselves called out for order, for structure, for a foreign hand to hold the reins. It's a strange story, and maybe that's why it lasted. It suggests legitimacy, consent. It paints Rurik not as a conqueror, but as a solution. And yet, the chronicle also serves a purpose. It was written by monks in a time when rulers needed a neat origin, a myth to stand on. So the messiness was scrubbed away, the rivalries, the suspicion, the slow erosion of local power. What was left was a clean version. The Slavs asked. Rurik answered. The Rus were born. But history rarely moves that smoothly, and you can still feel the grain of tension underneath. Rurik didn't arrive alone. He brought warriors, enforcers, loyal men with salt in their beards and blood on their hands. He wasn't handed power. He carved it dash. with deals, with tribute, and with the threat of what would happen if either failed. Still, he wasn't hated, at least not by all. Enough people accepted his rule, that his name survived where others didn't. And that alone, in an age without record keeping, in a time when rulers could disappear in a single season, is remarkable. So maybe it doesn't matter exactly where he came from. What matters is what followed. The laws, the roads, the dynasty, the merging of languages and customs that gave shape to the future. And perhaps it's fitting that the man who shaped a people remains half hidden himself, more fog than fire, but warm enough to light the path ahead. Imagine waking up in a wooden house with a Norse roof and Slavic walls. The fire burns in the center, but it's fed with birch logs, not pine. Your bowl is carved with runes --, but the stew inside is thick with forest roots and fermented grains you'd never seen before you arrived here. Outside, the snow is melting. You hear a voice call to a neighbor. It's not your language, but you understand it anyway. This is what the early Rus lived through, a world where language had no homeland. The Norse tongue traveled by boat. The Slavic one walked the land. One came with laws and the other came with lullabies. And over time, they met in kitchens, in markets, in marriage. The children of this meeting didn't speak either language purely. They mixed them, not by intent but by habit. A word for horse from the Norse, a word for God from the Slavs, a gesture from one, a curse from the other. No school taught them, no priest sanctioned them. But it worked, because people learn what they need to live. Food changed too. The Norse brought dried fish, butter, and meat, smoked on iron grates. The Slavs shared pickled mushrooms, dense breads, and fermented drink, stored in pottery sealed with beeswax. Recipes weren't written, they were taught, by firelight, by hunger, by whatever was growing that year. Soon, no one remembered which dish came from where, only that it filled the stomach and softened the frost. Clothing mixed as well. Slavic tunics, loose and layered, worn with Norse belts and fur-lined boots. Jewelry made of Baltic amber, hung beside hammered Norse brooches. And in weddings, some brides sang in 2 languages, or none, only in rhythm, only in dance. Was this unity? Not really. But it wasn't division either. It was something slower, something more practical than political, more personal than tribal. Not everyone accepted it. Some elders shook their heads at borrowed words. Some warriors scoffed at eating pickled cabbage. But the world was changing. And in the long dark of winter, no one complained if the stew was warm. And the voice beside you was kind. Before the scribes, before the parchment, before ink was precious, there were rules. They weren't written. They weren't even spoken the same way each time. But they existed. Because even in a land of shifting rivers and borrowed gods, people needed to know what was allowed and what was not. In Rurik's time, law wasn't a scroll. It was a memory, held by the elders, carried in stories, reinforced by consequence. If a man stole grain, there was no judge, no clerk, but there was a meeting, around a fire, beneath the watching eyes of neighbors. And someone would speak the words, "This is not how we live here." It wasn't about guilt. It was about repair. You might give 2 sacks of flour, or work the victim's land for a season, or be sent away for a year. A silent exile more punishing than any cell. The punishment wasn't meant to humiliate. It was meant to heal. because in a settlement this small, no one could afford enemies, not with winter coming. Rurik respected these customs. He may have added some of his own, based on Norse things, based on experience. But he didn't erase what was there. He listened. He adapted. Because power, in those days, wasn't enforced with armies. It was maintained with consent. And consent could vanish. Faster than snow on a warm roof. He likely held Vesh meetings. Gatherings where free men spoke, voiced complaints, settled border disputes, chose leaders. It wasn't democracy, but it was something close. A fragile, communal way of keeping the peace in a place where kings did not yet exist. What's remarkable is not how much power Rurik had, but how little he needed to use it. He ruled by anchoring, by staying, by listening just enough and acting only when necessary. No tyranny, no proclamations, just the slow emergence of something resembling law. And over time, these unwritten rules would become foundations for trade, for justice, for succession. They would harden into precedent, then into policy, then, much later, into ink on paper. But it all began with people sitting in circles, passing judgment with soft voices, and trying, always trying to survive together. In the north, the rivers were teachers. They showed you how to move through a world without roads. They didn't just carry boats, they carried memory. And for the early Rus, they carried something else entirely, possibility. The Volkhov, the Dnieper, the Don, the Neva. They connected more than lakes. They were veins in the body of the land. And if you followed them far enough, through swamp and stone, past wild boar and beaches, you would eventually reach something else. You would reach the edge of the world they knew. And beyond that edge, a world they only imagined. Rurik's successors understood this. They didn't just settle. They moved. Downriver, southward, toward warmth, toward wealth, toward Constantinople. They didn't always arrive peacefully. The Rus-Byzantine treaties that came later, so carefully worded, so formal, were not born from diplomacy. They were born from raids. Fierce, burning raids, when longships appeared like teeth on the water and struck the richest city the known world had ever built. But those raids turned into something else. They turned into trade, into tribute, into treaties that allowed Rus merchants to stay in Constantinople for months at a time, to sell fur, honey, amber, wax, and to buy silk, gold thread, icons, wine. And with each return journey up the river, those goods carried something more than value. They carried a whisper. This is what a state could be. Imagine the impact. Men who had only seen timber halls now gazed at marble, at libraries, at crowds so large they swallowed your name. They watched the emperor appear behind veils, his throne rising from beneath the floor, jewels winking like small stars. And then they returned to Ladoga, to Novgorod, to frostbitten Kiev, and slowly, quietly, they began to build. Not copies, not Byzantium in the north, but echoes. A hall more ornate than before, a coin bearing the mark of a ruler, a new kind of church. At first just wood and whispers, but soon, much more. The rivers did not just carry goods, they carried vision. And the Rus began to see themselves, not as borderland traders or war bands, but as something with continuity, a people, a state, a name, long after Rurik's bones had vanished into earth. his name remained above ground. Not just remembered, but used. By princes, by scribes, by monks who needed an origin, and by rulers who needed legitimacy. He became more than a man. He became a cornerstone. And yet, for all that, there are no great poems about him, no oaths sworn on his sword, no relics paraded through cities, because Rurik wasn't legendary the way kings often are. He was inevitable. The quiet start, the low drumbeat, the thing that came before the thing. In the primary chronicle, his story is told in only a few lines. But what follows? The wars, the princes, the churches, the betrayals, all begin from those lines. And maybe that's the point. Sometimes history is loud. Sometimes it's subtle. And sometimes it's a name you pass down. Because it means we came from somewhere. For centuries, the Rurikid dynasty ruled the Kievan Rus and beyond. From the forests of Novgorod to the wide stone streets of Kiev, their bloodline held power, even when the world around them fractured, even after Mongol invasions, even after princely feuds. When Moscow rose, it claimed Rurik's name. When Ivan became the first Tsar, he did so as the final thread of that old Norse Slavic story. Rurik never wrote a law, never built a palace, never led a grand army across distant sands, but he became the ancestor of memory. Every generation added to him. Some imagined his features, others embroidered his virtues, but all agreed. It began with him, and in that way, he became what so few conquerors ever do. He became gentle, not in life, but in memory, wrapped in snow, carved into tales, whispered in the cracks between facts. The man who came from the sea and gave a people their name. If you sail up the Volkhov River in early spring, when the ice has just begun to pull away from the banks, you might miss it. A small bend, a huddle of earth, some low mounds crowned with grass, some old stones that barely catch the light. But that bend holds the first Russian city, or at least the bones of one. Staraya Ladoga, Old Ladoga, the place where timelines fray and braid themselves into something unexpected. To archaeologists, it's a gold mine. To historians, a riddle. To the people who live there today, it's quiet. But beneath that quiet, beneath layers of soil and snow and time, there is something else. There are ships, and tools, and bones. There are beads that were never local, coins from lands no one here had ever seen, and carvings whose meanings have been half forgotten. The first thing to understand is this. Ladoga was never meant to last. Not in the way empires last. Not in the way cities with cathedrals and walls do. It began as a stopover. A seasonal site, perhaps. A place where people came to barter, rest, fish, and then move on. But something changed. It grew. Slowly at first. Then quickly. Then permanently. The location made it inevitable. It was where the river narrowed, where the lake fed the inland routes, where boats could be pulled ashore for repairs, or for safety. And so they came, from the Norse world, men with axes and longships, from the Slavic woods, people with baskets of salt fish and herbs, hunters wrapped in bark fiber cloaks, and from beyond, Baltic traders, Volga merchants, stray Greeks looking for a foothold in the north. By the mid-8th century, Ladoga was no longer a waypoint. It was a hub. Not a city yet. Not in marble or walls, but in function. Goods passed through it. So did stories. So did people who would never return. And like all ancient places, it began to collect its own gravity. But gravity, in archaeology, is not felt. It's sifted. Through shards, through burned wood, through buttons, broken glass, and fingerprints left in clay. And Staraya Ladoga has offered all of these, but not all at once. It gives its secret slowly, in drips, like water thawing from a roof at dawn. You don't need a monument to remember someone. Sometimes a worn clasp is enough, or a bead tucked beside a skull, a knife with no handle, a shadow where a body once lay. At Ladoga, there are many such shadows, mounds, small and rounded, softened by time, and overgrown with grass that hums in the wind. They are not marked. They carry no inscriptions, only memory held in soil. The burial sites around Ladoga are among the oldest in the Rus lands, and among the most puzzling, because they don't follow just one tradition. Some graves are Scandinavian, in style shallow pits with goods laid beside the body. Iron swords, oval brooches, clasped coins from foreign shores. Others feel Slavic. Cremations mostly. Ashes mixed with sand. Bones fractured and blackened, placed in ceramic urns. And some are harder to define. There are burials with no goods at all, just bone and earth, laid gently, without wealth, without symbols, only the position of the body. And even that sometimes breaks the pattern. One lies curled like a child, another with arms crossed over the chest as if in prayer. There are women buried with blades, men with weaving tools, and children with nothing. What does it mean? That's the puzzle. Norse and Slavic side by side, or from a people already blended, a culture still deciding who it was. Were the women warriors, or were blades laid beside them as symbols of protection, of lineage, of the world they left behind? Did the poor burials mark outcasts, or simply those who had little, even in life? The truth is, no one knows. Archaeologists can test the soil, date the coins, analyze the bones for diet and disease, but they cannot read minds. They cannot summon the final thoughts of the man buried with a broken comb, or the woman laid to rest in a dress fastened with amber. They can only infer, suggest, and sometimes guess. But still, the graves speak. They speak through their silence, through what they include and what they don't. They show us that Ladoga was not just a marketplace. It was a home. And like all homes, it held sorrow. People died here, and others buried them with care. Even if they had no tombs, even if they left no names, their presence lingers in the shape of the land. They're easy to miss. No larger than berries, smooth to the touch, worn down by centuries. But in the soft, dark layers of Ladoga's soil, beads have been found. Dozens, hundreds, made of glass, amber, silver, even rare stones not found anywhere nearby. Tiny things, but they tell stories the size of continents. Some were blue, so deep they looked almost black, made with cobalt from the Middle East. Others were striped like frozen candy, their colors fused in layers, only possible with the furnaces of Baghdad or Constantinople. A few beads, just a few, were even more mysterious, made from volcanic stone, or rolled from shell and glazed with a sheen long since faded. These weren't just decorations, they were passports. They came from elsewhere. No one knows how many hands they passed through. A merchant in the Caucasus, a caravan guard in the Khazar lands, a widow trading cloth on the riverbank. Each time, passed on, traded, lost, found again, and somehow washed up here, in the mud of the Volkhov River. In Ladoga, these beads show up in graves, scattered across floors, and even hidden beneath hearthstones. Perhaps used in ritual, perhaps just forgotten. But they mattered. To wear one was to say something, that you had seen far things, that your kin had wealth, that your life, even here in the northern cold, was touched by distant heat. Imagine a girl in Ladoga, her hands small, turning a bead over in her palm. She has never seen Baghdad. She does not know what an empire is, but she wears its glow around her neck, threaded into her clothing, woven into her sense of self. She knows only that her mother gave it to her, that it came with a story, and that it shines. That is enough. These beads remind us, trade isn't just about cargo. It's about beauty and longing, and the quiet fact that people, even in the hardest times, want to adorn their world. They want color in the grey, pattern in the plain, a little piece of somewhere else, right here, where the wind bites and the fire burns low. The first thing archaeologists often find is not a wall, or a weapon, or a grave. It's a fire pit, a dark circle in the earth, charred around the edges, stained with ash and splinters of burnt bone. In Staraya Ladoga, these fire pits appear like footprints, marks left not by steps but by survival. They tell us something simple. Someone lived here. They cooked here. They warmed their hands. They told stories while the wind scratched at the door. And in the morning, they stirred the embers and did it all again. Nearby, you often find the fragments. Broken combs made of bone, clay pots with their rims chipped away, iron nails bent out of shape, spindle whorls worn smooth by wool and repetition. Nothing glorious, nothing you'd place in a treasure room, but real, lived in, true. These are the things that never make it into chronicles, because the people who used them, they weren't kings, they weren't warriors, they were mothers and weavers and children dragging their fingers through the dirt. They boiled fish bones into broth. They shaped shoes from bark and leather. They trimmed beards and scraped hides. The rhythm of their lives wasn't recorded, but it was steady. Inside the wooden houses, you would have smelled smoke and moss. Maybe beeswax if they could afford a candle. The walls were lined with furs, the floor with rushes. In summer, the door stayed open. In winter, it stayed shut. And the fire never died. It was banked at night, covered in ash, so that morning would not begin in cold darkness. Sometimes, archaeologists find charred food scraps in these hearths. A crust of bread, burnt to black, fish scales flaked away. A lump of what may have been porridge, long dried into clay. These aren't mistakes. They're moments, the kind you don't think are important, until someone uncovers them centuries later and realizes someone was here, someone just like you, someone tired, someone laughing, someone scraping burnt dough from a pan and muttering about it. Fire pits and fragments don't tell us what people believed. They don't reveal strategies or dynasties, but they whisper how people lived. And in Staraya Ladoga, those whispers are everywhere. Beneath the frost, in the seams of ancient dwellings, in the ash that still smells faintly of pine. When we imagine ancient cities, we often picture walls, high and thick, with gates made of oak and iron, watchtowers rising like teeth against the sky. But in Staraya Ladoga, it wasn't like that. Or at least, not at first. The earliest phases of Ladoga had no stone fortifications. There was no great wall circling the town, no gatehouse flanked by guards with spears. Instead, there were palisades. Modest wooden fences driven into the earth, bound with rope or sinew, maybe a ditch or two, dug hastily with wooden spades, to slow horses or carts. Functional, simple, temporary, more gesture than guarantee. This doesn't mean Ladoga was weak. It means it was trusted, at least for a while. The river, wide and fast, was its first defense. Its remoteness, its forest cover, its position in a world still full of space. These things offered protection that stone could not. And yet, over time, as trade increased, as visitors became settlers, as rumors of gold filtered in from the south, that changed. By the 9th century, archaeologists have found signs of reinforcement. Burnt timber posts, earthworks, and eventually, the faint footprint of a wooden fortress on the high bank. Not a castle, not a citadel, but something more than nothing. Why? Not because of enemies, necessarily, but because of importance. Ladoga was becoming worth fighting over. It sat between rivers, between peoples, between the fur-rich north and the silver-laced south. It was no longer just a stop. It was a node. And nodes attract pressure. So the people of Ladoga did what people always do. They adapted. They used what they had. Wood, clay, effort, and time. They built defenses that could be raised in a season and repaired in a week. They didn't aim for immortality. They aimed for safety. And when the frost came, they leaned into the cold, knowing it slowed horses, silenced footfalls, and turned the land itself into a barrier. It's easy to overlook Ladoga's defenses because there are no grand ruins, no shattered battlements or fallen towers. But maybe that's the point. It was a place that chose flexibility over force, proximity over paranoia. It built just enough wall to say, "This is ours." And then it got back to work. You wouldn't expect to find writing here. Not this early. Not this far north. Not in a place of wood smoke and barter and rivers. But in Ladoga, the soil disagrees. Scratched into bone. Etched on slate. Carved faintly into a beam. That once held up someone's ceiling. Symbols, letters, names perhaps. Or warnings. Or prayers. They don't shout, they whisper. Some are clearly runes. Letters from the Norse world, angular and spare, designed to be cut into bark and stone. Others are more mysterious, simple marks, repeated curves, diagonal slashes arranged in ways that seem deliberate, but remain untranslated. These may be tally marks, used by traders to track goods, or house signs, a kind of proto-heraldry, identifying a family, a guild, a lineage, or they may be something else entirely. One slate fragment, unearthed near what was once a hearth, shows a small grid of interlocking shapes, carefully carved with a bone stylus. Some believe it was a child's practice tablet. Others think it was part of a game, or perhaps a charm to protect the household from fire or fever. There is no inscription telling us, just the scratches worn by time, but stubborn in their meaning. Writing here was never ornamental. It wasn't for poetry or law codes, not yet. It was functional, occult, practical. It lived in the cracks of everyday life. On the handle of a spoon, on the back of a brooch, on the base of a spindle whorl. Tiny, secretive, personal. In some graves, they've found rune-inscribed combs. These were not luxurious. They were everyday objects, but even so, someone felt the need to mark them, to bind them with language, to make them more than just wood and teeth. Perhaps it was a name, perhaps a curse, perhaps a message to the dead. We don't know, but the intent remains, etched in silence. One discovery, just a few centimeters long, bears a faint crosshatch of lines that some believe is a calendar, a record of lunar days tracked by someone who measured the sky. As they measured the seasons, it could be a priest tool, or a farmer's, or a dreamer's. All we know is that someone cared enough to track time in a place that had, until then, mostly lived in the present. These scripts, if that's what they are, remind us that literacy doesn't begin in books. It begins in need. The need to remember, to bless, to count, to warn. And in Ladoga, that need was already growing, one quiet symbol at a time. They glitter in the soil like tiny promises. Silver dirhams from the Islamic caliphates, Byzantine falls bearing emperors' profiles, even the occasional Frankish denier, its edges worn soft by river travel. But in Staraya Ladoga, coins were not always used to buy things, at least not only. Many of the coins found here, dozens upon dozens, show holes drilled through their tops, not damage, not accident, intention. They were strung on cords, worn around necks, tied into clothing, hidden in the hems of cloaks. To modernize, they may look like jewelry, but they weren't just that. They were power, a protective talisman, a sign of reach, of contact with the faraway world, a way to say, I am not alone. Some were polished smooth by fingers, rubbed like worry stones. Others were kept near fire pits, perhaps offerings, or markers of status, or memory. In one grave, a child was buried with 5 coins around the neck, all from different regions, all older than the child. Were they heirlooms, gifts, the scattered wealth of a parent gone before? We do not know. But the choice was made, and it mattered. Trade in Ladoga was vibrant, but it wasn't always about exchange. Sometimes coins came ashore like driftwood, tossed from the pocket of a dead man, or offered to spirits, or sewn into clothes as a hidden stash, in case of bad fortune. And so they carried not just value, but stories. Imagine this. You're a trader in Ladoga. The year is 850. You've just bartered a barrel of dried fish for 2 silver coins. You slip one into your pouch. But the other, you drill it, you wear it. Not for wealth, but for protection. Because it came from far away. Because the man who gave it to you died in the winter storm. Because something in its shine feels ancient and lucky. You don't ask why. You just keep it close. Coins, like beads, were more than currency here. They were anchors to identity, to family, to belief. And in a world of wooden walls, smoky air, and shifting alliances, a small disc of silver was something solid. Today, these coins are catalogued, labeled, and filed. They sit behind glass in quiet museums. But once, they jangled at the waist of a young woman, stepping out of her home into the cold morning mist of Staraya Ladoga. Some places rise by shouting, others survive by whispering. Staraya Ladoga did neither. It simply endured. There are no epic poems about it, no gilded chronicles, no sweeping murals showing battles beneath its walls. And yet, When archaeologists began peeling back the earth, they found it had always been there, a little ahead of its time, and somehow a little behind it too. Ladoga didn't try to become an empire. It didn't raise kings. It didn't lay claims to crowns. Instead, it became a kind of quiet hinge, a turning point in the geography of the north, a slipknot in the net of rivers where cultures brushed past each other and didn't always feel the need to collide. That may be why it lasted. It didn't declare itself. It didn't ask to be known. Instead, it absorbed new people, new tools, new gods sometimes, and it changed gently, not with the violence of conquest, but the stillness of silt building in a riverbed. In the early records, Ladoga barely appears. Even when it should, it's always near something. The first stop, the background, the place someone left behind on their way to glory. But in the gaps between those stories, it kept going. In that, it teaches us something strange. That survival doesn't always look like victory. Sometimes it looks like blending in, being valuable enough to visit, but not so powerful that others come to take. Being modest in growth, but constant. This invisibility, intentional or not, meant Ladoga avoided many of the fates that struck louder places. It wasn't sacked. It wasn't burned to the ground. It wasn't swallowed by greed or crowned in hubris. It weathered change like stone weathers wind. Eroded, perhaps, but still present. Even today, you could visit Ladoga and not know what it was. You might see old logs, a mound, just a little too round to be natural, a bit of wall stone, barely taller than your knee. You'd walk past it, and in a way, that's how it always meant to be. Clothing leaves no words behind, no books, no speeches, just fibers, needle holes in leather, a rusted pin once polished, a coil of bronze wire pressed into the shape of a brooch. But in Staraya Ladoga, even these were stories. Stories people wore. The people who lived here. They didn't wear crowns. They wore layers of wool, of linen, of felted fur in the long winters, stitched not for style, but for endurance. And yet, they still found room for beauty. A woman's dress might be clasped with oval brooches. A distinctly Scandinavian fashion. Heavy, rounded, etched with spirals and suns. Not flashy, but sure. A Slavic tunic might be fastened at the neck, with a simple bone toggle carved with care. Not loud, but intentional. Children often wore strings of beads, not just around the neck, but sewn into hems, stitched along sleeves, sometimes hidden inside garments entirely. Were they protective charms, status markers, simply pretty? We may never know, but their placement was deliberate. Someone put them there with thought. Hairstyles leave no fossil, but combs do. And in Ladoga, combs are found everywhere. Carved from antler, sturdy, utilitarian, sometimes folded like a pocket knife. They speak to care, to grooming, to presence, to the idea that no matter how cold the wind, no matter how short the day, you still prepared your face for the world. Jewelry was often local, but sometimes not. A brooch from Gotland, a ring from the Baltic coast, a silver chain with eastern knots. Not all were worn for show. Some were hidden, sewn into belts wrapped in cloth, kept warm against the chest like secrets. And then there were the tattoos. No ink survives, but descriptions later, from Arab travelers, suggest that people here marked themselves. Symbols, spirals, trees and animals, maybe for the gods. maybe for ancestors, maybe just to remember who they were and where they came from. In a place like Ladoga, a borderland, a mixing bowl, identity wasn't fixed. You could be Norse by blood, Slavic by language, Khazar by trade. Your clothing reflected that. A patchwork not of confusion, but of adaptation, of choosing which parts to keep and which to let go. By the time the 10th century arrived, Staraya Ladoga had changed. Not in a sudden way, not in the fashion of cities that burn and rebuild, but like the slow turning of seasons. You wouldn't notice the change from day to day, but if you left for 20 winters and then came back, you'd see it. There were more homes now, built sturdier, longer. Some had stone foundations. The logs were thicker, the thatch neater. The riverbank, once scattered with boats, now had organized landings. Wooden piers reaching into the water like slow-growing fingers. And on the hill, the faint lines of something larger. Not a temple, not a fortress. Something in between. Some say Ladoga was becoming a capital, the first seat of the Rus. That Rurik, yes, that Rurik, chose it as his base, before moving inland to Novgorod. Others disagree. They say it was never more than a strong outpost, a halfway place between power and wilderness. The truth is unclear, and maybe it doesn't matter, because Ladoga's legacy isn't in conquest, it's in continuity. While other cities rose and fell, Ladoga remained. It never quite disappeared, never fully claimed the center, but never left the map. It became a crossroads that no one could erase. Faded, yes, overshadowed, but still present, still settling beneath the frost each year, quiet as ever. Today, archaeologists still return to Staraya Ladoga. They dig in summer, sift in autumn, and mark each layer like a page in a story they're still learning how to read. And what they find is always a little bit off. A Norse sword in a Slavic home, a Persian coin beside a local hearth, a comb carved in a style no one recognizes, pieces that don't quite fit, and yet form a picture all the same. If you walk there now, you might not see much. A small church, some mounds in the grass, a breeze that carries no urgency. But beneath your feet, Ladoga is still breathing. Not loudly, not insistently, just enough. That's the thing about the past. The loud stories. They're easy to find, easy to tell. But the quiet ones, the ones that don't raise flags or statues, they require listening, stillness, patience, reverence. Staraya Ladoga offers us a quiet truth, that even without glory, even without fame, a place can matter, a people can matter, and sometimes the softest imprint is the one that lasts the longest. In the north, wealth doesn't shout. It doesn't sit in golden halls or blaze from polished thrones. It moves in silence, bundled in fur, tucked in riverboats, passed from calloused hand to hand. And in the Viking Rus lands, that silence was filled with riches, not hoarded in vaults, but circulated. Along riverbanks, through forests, over snow-packed trails, where even the breath of a merchant seemed to freeze mid-air. Here, trade wasn't a market square of noise and color. It was a journey, months long, sometimes a year, from the icy forests of the north, all the way down to the domes of Constantinople. And it began with fur. The forests of Rus held creatures prized far beyond their homeland. Sable, beaver, fox, ermine, software dense, unmatched. furs weren't just warmth. They were currency. They were status. They were gifts for emperors. And they traveled, packed into boats, wrapped in oiled hides, carried by men who knew how to read the river like a map. But fur was only the beginning. From the north came honey, wax, amber, slaves, yes, and rare timber. From the south came silver dirhams, Byzantine silks, fine glass, spices, icons, objects so delicate they had to be wrapped in felt and kept close to the chest, as if they might shatter under the weight of the wind. And in the middle of this web, neither fully Norse nor fully Slavic, nor entirely of the East, stood the Russians, translators, guards, navigators, deal makers. They were the hinge on which the world turned, the middlemen of the medieval North. And what they built was not a kingdom, but a corridor, one that glimmered with quiet wealth, in a world still mostly carved from wood and ice. Long before gold ruled the world, it was silver that mattered most. And for the Rus, silver didn't come from mines in the north, but from deserts far to the south, from Persia, from Samarkand, from Baghdad, glimmering in the heat. They were called dirhams, round, flat, and stamped with elegant Arabic script. No images, only words, verses from the Quran, names of caliphs, dates that meant little to the men who traded them, but who knew their weight, like they knew their own breath. These coins made their way north by river, not by ships at sea, but by long, narrow boats, carved for speed and shallows. They passed from hand to hand, Khazar to Bulgar, Bulgar to Rus, Rus to Slavic village, and then, sometimes, into the forest where no empire had ever ruled. In Staraya, Ladoga, and other trade outposts, the ground is thick with them, buried hoards, dropped coins, necklaces made of pierced dirhams, strung like pearls of faraway sunlight. Some hoards are large, dozens of coins packed into clay pots, tucked beneath floors, beneath hearths, beneath trust. Others are small. A handful of silver hidden in a boot sole or beneath a fur-lined hat. Not wealth, but hope. What makes this trade strange is that the people using these coins didn't always spend them, not in the way we think. There were no silver marketplaces, no shopping for food with foreign coin. Instead, the coins were often weighed, cut, melted, reshaped. Silver wasn't money, it was metal, and metal was survival. Still, the dirhams told stories. Imagine being a young trader in Ladoga, holding a coin stamped in a language you couldn't read, but that your father had once bartered for a winter's worth of grain. It might have come from a place you would never see, from a man whose skin looked different than yours, whose god had a different name, whose land was too hot for snow. And yet, the coin was here, solid and cold in your hand, proof that the world was bigger than the pine forest, and that, maybe, you belonged to it. The Silver River flowed for centuries. It shaped alliances, fed wars, funded kings. But in the north, it was always quiet. No roaring bazaars, no marble banks, just cold hands and long journeys, and the faint, familiar clink of silver in a land that gleamed with fur and frost. Imagine you've never seen silk before, not woven, not worn, not touched. You live in a land of wool and fur, fibers that itch a little when wet, that gather frost in the folds, that keep you alive in a wind that bites through bone. Then one day, someone arrives down the river with cloth that moves like water, silk, fine as a spider's web, smooth as river ice, lighter than breath, yet dyed in colours, so deep they seem to glow from within. Purple, gold, saffron, and deepest blue, the kind of fabric that caught the light and turned heads before it even made a sound. It came from the south, always the south, from Constantinople, the city called Miklagard by the Norse, the great city, the Golden Horn. There, silk was woven in guarded workshops, its methods kept secret, its threads as precious as coin. It passed through hands of merchants and envoys, was packed in felt and locked in chests, and travelled upriver like a whisper. For the Rus, silk was not common, not worn by villagers, not even by most warriors. It was reserved for chiefs, for envoys, for brides, a token of alliance, a mark of connection, a sign that you had touched the empire. In graves around Ladoga and further inland, fragments of silk have been found, threadbare, tattered, clinging to bronze brooches like dried petals. Some are just ribbons wrapped around wooden combs. Others are larger pieces, lining boots tucked beneath fur coats. Most curious of all, some were never even worn, simply buried, as if their purpose wasn't fashion but memory. To hold silk in this world was to carry proof that you had seen more than forest, that you had heard other languages, that someone far away had given or traded you something that shimmered in the dark. You might never go to Constantinople, but you could wear a thread of it, and that was enough. Silk didn't last long in the cold north. The fibers were fragile. They wore through quickly. Sometimes a cloak was worn once, at a wedding, at a funeral, during a ritual, and then folded away, not as clothing, but as evidence. This was not luxury for luxury's sake. It wasn't decadence. It was symbolic. To own silk was to say, we are not at the edge of the world. We are connected, even here among the pines, in the land of frozen mornings and river mist, before silver, before silk, before script. There was fur. And in the north, fur wasn't a luxury. It was a promise. Imagine the forest in early winter. The leaves are gone. The air is still. Snow dusts the pines like ash. And somewhere just out of sight, a sable moves through the underbrush, silent as breath. That animal, small, quick, dark, is worth more than a blade, more than a cow, more even than a man. In the right hands, its pelt could buy the favor of a prince. Fur in the Viking Rus world was more than warmth. It was currency. It was tax. It was tribute. Kings demanded it. Clans counted it. Merchants weighed it. Trappers lived and died for it. And so, a kind of pact formed between humans and the forest. Not one of peace exactly, but of dependence. The forest gave sables, foxes, beavers, ermines, each pelt thick and valuable. And in return, humans gave reverence, superstition, offerings. Before a hunt, some would leave food beneath trees, say words to the spirits of the forest, thank the animal, even as they took its skin, because they knew. Take too much, too greedily, and the forest would stop giving. In some parts of Rus, entire villages were known by their furs. The people were not farmers, they were hunters. Their children grew up with traps and knives instead of plows. Their wealth didn't grow from the ground. It moved on four legs, vanishing into snow the moment it heard you breathe. Fur didn't travel alone. It was bundled in waxed leather. stuffed into reed baskets, marked with bone tags or wooden slips, not with names but with weights. It went downriver in spring, just after the thaw, and from there it moved out like wind. To the markets of the south, to desert cities, to the hems of robes worn by emperors, who never knew where it came from, and yet every fur carried the cold with it, even beneath silk, even in palaces lit by candles. The scent of pine and smoke still clung to it, a trace of the forest, of the man who trapped it, of the pact made between the north and the world beyond it. In most of the medieval world, borders were marked with blood, but in the Viking Rus north, they were often marked with gifts, not coins, not contracts, but objects that meant something. A bundle of furs, a brooch from a faraway land, a ring of silver coiled like a snake, a fine blade given not for battle, but for honor. These were not bribes, nor were they taxes. They were gestures, a way to say, I see you. I know your worth. I want peace. Among the Rus, gifts were sometimes the only language that mattered. If a trader brought silks and coins, but forgot the proper offering, he might be turned away at the river gate. If a chief wanted to seal an alliance with a distant clan, he didn't send messengers. He sent goods. There are stories, whispers from old Arab and Byzantine texts, about envoys arriving barefoot, carrying carved ivory, or leading tethered animals with dyed fur. Sometimes they brought spices, sometimes combs, mirrors, or beads, always something that carried weight, not in pounds, but in presence. One particularly fine type of gift, the sword, not the kind used in war, but the kind made to be seen, etched, balanced, sometimes never drawn, given from one leader to another, a bridge, not a blade. Silk was another, so rare, so expensive, that even a strip the width of a hand was seen as a gesture of great honor. In one Rus chronicle, a princess is said to have gifted silk to a man she refused to marry, not out of affection, but as a mark of respect, a gentle way to say no, without causing war. These exchanges shaped diplomacy. A gifted brooch might end a feud. A silver chain might secure passage through dangerous lands. A carved animal figure might become a symbol, placed at the edge of a camp as a mark of peace. The Rus didn't have embassies. They had rituals, and trade was one of them. To give a gift wasn't to lose wealth. It was to gain standing, to build memory, to be remembered. So much of this history has vanished. The furs rotted, the silks unraveled, the jewelry melted, the swords repurposed. But the idea behind them, the act of gifting, remains even now when we give someone a token, not for its use, but for its meaning. We echo something ancient, a time when flags had not yet been sown, and gifts spoke louder than titles. There were no grand bazaars here, no stone halls ringing with sellers' voices, no tiled walkways beneath gold-tipped domes. The Rus didn't build marketplaces that stood year-round. Instead, they waited for the thaw, for the smoke, for the signal, and then, for a few short days, the markets appeared. They were not places, they were events. Spring melt, rivers free of ice, forest paths no longer choked with snow. And suddenly, traders would arrive, by boat, by cart, by foot. They came from the east, from the Baltic, from the steppes, and on the open ground just beyond a village, or in the shadow of a wooden fort, a market was born, The fires came first, dozens of them, warming pots of porridge, boiling water for dyeing cloth, roasting meat, softening hides, and above them, the smoke rose like flags, marking this patch of land as open for exchange. Here, money was rare. Wealth was barter. A man with a basket of forest mushrooms might trade for a strip of linen. A woman with beeswax might find herself offered a silver ring. A child with dried fish might leave wearing a new belt. It was flexible, uncertain, human. Not always fair, but always alive. The goods came in wrapped bundles, sometimes dripping with melting snow, sometimes smelling of salt and oil. There were fur traders with their hides folded like stacked parchment, ironworkers offering nails, hinges and blades, cloth merchants unrolling bolts of fabric like sails. You could buy a comb, a horse, a brooch, or a bride, all within a span of days. And then, just as quickly, the market would vanish. The fires died down. The carts rolled away. The last of the porridge was scraped from the pot, and where the market had stood, only footprints in the ash, only coins buried by accident, only fragments left behind in the rush. Archaeologists sometimes find these places. They call them seasonal trading grounds, temporary, nomadic cities of commerce. But the people who built them didn't give them names. They were simply what happened when the time was right. To live in this world was to live in rhythm, with the rivers, with the ice, with the gathering of strangers who would be gone before the moon turned. And if you were lucky, you returned home not just richer, but with a story about the man who gave you a coin with a hole in it, or the woman who bartered 6 fox pelts for a blue ribbon, or the silent trader who spoke no language you knew, but gave you a piece of glass shaped like a tear. These were the markets of the Rus, made not from stone, but from timing. Before the Rus were rulers, they were travelers, and to travel south, towards silver, silk, and cities, meant passing through a gate, not a wooden door, not a border marked in stone, but a toll, a presence, a name spoken with caution, Khazar. The Khazars were a powerful confederation of Turkic peoples, steppe riders, river watchers, empire builders of the grasslands. From the Caspian to the Volga, they controlled the arteries of trade. And if you were a Rus merchant or leader, hoping to reach the markets of the Islamic world, you had no choice but to go through them. They taxed the river, not the land, not the goods. The river. It was brilliant. You passed through their waters, you paid, and in exchange, you gained protection from raiders, from bandits, from the unpredictable moods of the frontier. Some Rus resented it, others accepted it. Still others tried to form bonds, alliances, marriages, pacts. There are tales of Rus warriors becoming Khazar envoys, of Slavic chiefs taking Khazar wives, of markets where Norse, Slavic, Khazar, and Arab languages mingled under the same canvas tent. But the Khazars weren't just a checkpoint, they were a filter. They influenced what moved north. Not just goods, but ideas, clothing, cooking methods, coins stamped with Arabic script, even religion. The Khazars famously converted, not to Islam, not to Christianity, but to Judaism. A political move, perhaps, but also a signal. They stood apart. To the Rus, this created both opportunity and uncertainty. You could bring back goods from the steppe that no one in your home village had ever seen. But you could also return with questions about gods, about borders, about who exactly was in control of these waters. And yet, there was a kind of understanding. The Khazars were not invaders. They were managers. They knew the rivers, the crossroads, the places where gold whispered and conflict grew silent. They didn't stop trade. They curated it. Eventually, their power faded. But for centuries, they were the unseen gatekeepers of the Rus trade network. Not loud, not glorious, but essential. Even now, in the rusted coins and buried beads of ancient Ladoga, you find traces of Khazar hands. And perhaps, in the way the Rus would later build their own tolls, their own taxes, their own ways of managing flow. You hear an echo of that first gate, a quiet model, long buried, still shaping. The Dnieper River was a road, not paved, not marked, but flowing, endlessly southward, toward the Black Sea and the shining domes of Constantinople. It was the artery of the Rus trade dream. But it was also a gauntlet. Imagine yourself on a boat, narrow, shallow-hulled, carved from a single pine tree. The sun is high, and the river glimmers like a knife. You paddle, you listen, not just to the water, but to the trees, to the silence between bends, to the birds that sometimes vanish all at once, because the Dnieper had rapids, and the rapids had names, not just falls or currents. They were named like spirits, feared like demons, honored like old gods. There was the Volkhovets, where boats cracked like eggshells. There was Galandri, where mist hung like a shroud. And there was Vnitos, where even seasoned traders held their breath and muttered charms beneath their tongues. To pass these places, the Rus would carry their boats, portage, wood on shoulder, oars tied tight, goods wrapped in fur and cloth, lashed to their backs. Step by careful step, they'd walk the banks, feet sinking into moss and wet soil, until the river smoothed again. These moments, pausing beneath pine trees, resting against boulders streaked with lichen, were more than logistical. They were ritual. Fires were lit, offerings burned. Sometimes the river was spoken to, like a person, like a gatekeeper, and gifts were tossed into the water. A coin, a comb, a drop of honey, a whispered word. The goal was not just survival, it was permission, because the Dnieper didn't just take you south, it took you through wildlands, through borders, through places where no map was accurate, and every silence felt like a decision being made. Those who reached the sea arrived changed, weathered, salt-streaked, eyes sharper, voices lower, and they carried their wares not just with pride, but with reverence, because every dirham, every pelt, every bolt of silk had made the journey. It had passed through the smoke, through the rapids, through the hush that lives in deep forest, and that made it valuable, not just as an object, but as a survivor. The river ends, the sea opens, and beyond the haze of salt and sun, you see it, Miklagard, the great city, not a place, an idea, so vast it seems to rise from the water. Walls like cliffs, domes like polished stones, flags moving in wind that smells not of pine, but of spice, smoke, and something older. The Rus had a name for it, Miklagard, the great fort, a city so rich in wonder that songs were sung about it before anyone you knew had ever seen it. It was a place of gold and judgment, of markets that never slept, of gods you didn't know, spoken in languages you couldn't follow, but somehow still understood. To reach this city was not just to succeed, it was to be tested, because no one entered Constantinople without purpose. The gates were guarded, heavily, walls layered like shields, watchtowers like teeth, and before you stepped foot on the stone roads, you had to ask for entry, for permission, for recognition. Some came as traders, bearing furs, wax, amber, slaves, bartering with local customs agents beneath the shadow of the Golden Horn. Others came as envoys, with messages, with gifts, with carefully prepared speeches, memorized over the length of a river journey. And still others came as soldiers, not invaders, but applicants, men hoping to join the Varangian Guard, elite bodyguards to the Byzantine emperor, tall, broad-shouldered, northern, trusted for their loyalty, their distance from local politics, their readiness to obey. But no matter how you entered, the city left a mark. Its markets overwhelmed, its churches towered, its mosaics shimmered in the low morning light. You might walk through a street where silk hung like banners overhead, where coins changed hands faster than wind through a flag, or stand beside a fountain that flowed not with water, but with wine once a year during festivals. Some Rus went home rich, others stayed, became citizens, traders, mercenaries, ghosts, and others never left the harbor. They stood at the gate, looked up at the walls, and decided the world inside was not theirs. But they remembered it. They told of it. Tales passed down in smoky halls, in longhouses, in camps far from any sea. And so Miklagard lived on, not just in Byzantine records, but in memory, as a dream, as a mirror, as a place that proved the world was wider than frost and fir trees. The trade routes stretched far, but in the end, everything returned home, to the pine forests, the frost, the snow-covered eaves of small wooden homes, the silence between wind gusts. And it was here, not in Constantinople or Baghdad, that the long echo of trade was felt. A single coin, buried beneath a hearthstone, a glass bead worn by a child too young to speak, a silk thread braided into a wedding dress that would last one winter. These were not symbols of empires. They were fragments, quiet transformations. In some villages, clay pots changed shape, not by accident, but by inspiration. A trader might return from the south, with a bowl made of something smooth, something strange, and the local potter, watching, would try to copy the curve. Not perfectly, but enough. Enough to say, we've seen other things. In longhouses, stories shifted. Tales of spirits began to mix, with stories of strange lands. New names entered the oral traditions, new rhythms. A man might speak of a desert he'd never seen, because his brother had traded there, and brought back a scarf that smelled faintly of cinnamon. But it wasn't just objects or tales. Expectations changed. A bride might ask for silver on her necklace. A chief might hold court with a foreign blade at his side, never drawn. Children might whisper about a far-off city, with golden gates and wine fountains, even if they didn't know where the sea began. Trade reshaped the ordinary. Wool was still worn, but lined with silk if the family could afford it. Carts were still wooden, but carved now, with patterns copied from foreign coins. The local gods were still prayed to, but in homes where bronze mirrors, brought from afar, reflected the candlelight during rituals. It wasn't about wealth. Not really. It was about presence. A sense that you were no longer at the edge. That the world did not stop at the riverbank, or the tree line, or the next valley. The world was woven in. With each fur traded, with each coin weighed, a little more of that world arrived and stayed. And when winter came, as it always did, those same people huddled around their fires, their long nights filled with stories, not of conquest, not of kings, but of journeys, of markets made of ash and ice, of distant gates and slow rivers, and the silent weight of silver in a leather pouch. And somewhere in the corner, a child would listen and dream of a road that led south. So now you know, not just the battles, not the raids or the iron-shod stories of conquest, but the quieter truth of how life unfolded along the rivers and forests of early Rus. It wasn't always loud, it wasn't always glorious, but it was real. Built on smoke, on furs, on frost-stiff fingers tying knots in silence. You've walked through the muddy streets of Ladoga, sat beside fire pits in trading camps, watched as merchants unpacked silk that shimmered like sunrise, and listened to the hush that falls just before a deal is struck. You followed the path of Rurik. Not the legend, but the man who made choices at dusk, who crossed languages and loyalties to shape something that would outlive him. You've seen the mystery of graves, read the runes in bones and beads, and wondered, like we all do, who placed that comb beside that skull, and why? You've traced the flow of furs and silver from the northern woods to the golden city by the sea. And now, you're back at the riverbank. The fire is dying low, the wind has settled, and all that remains is the feeling that the river never truly slept, even now beneath cities and dams, beneath roads and farms. The old current still moves. It remembers the footprints in ash, the paddles carved from pine, the boatmen who whispered to rapids, and the soft thump of coins on the floor of a yurt. Thank you for drifting through this quiet story. If you're still awake, perhaps you're feeling the pull of that old rhythm, the rustle of trade winds, the hush of moss underfoot, the distant echo of someone arriving by boat before the sun has fully risen. And if you're already asleep, then maybe, just maybe, you found your way to Miklagard through snow, fire, and the slow turn of the stars.